Shalom! Today we study our last wisdom book, and what is also probably the last book of the Old Testament to be written. This is the Wisdom of Solomon. Little introduction to our book. This book is called The Wisdom of Solomon according to Septuagint manuscripts, or the Greek Bible, but what we know for sure is that it was not written by King Solomon. This is a pseudepigraphic book that claims Solomonic authorship, but to be fair, Solomon is never mentioned in the text. Only in the style of the book and the content, we can see that the author tried to mimic essentially the circumstances of Solomon's life. For example, we see that in chapter 9, verses 7, 8, and then verse 12, where the author says, "You have chosen me to be king of your people, to be judge over your sons and daughters." And also this author supposedly was given a command to build a temple on the Lord's holy mountain. So clearly this alludes to the role of Solomon. Later there's a beautiful prayer for wisdom which evokes the prayer of Solomon for wisdom in the first book of Kings. But we know for sure it was not written by Solomon because this is clearly a book written in the Hellenistic period with strong Greek influences. In fact, the book was written in Greek and not in Hebrew. It does retain parallelisms of Hebrew poetry because more than likely the author was a Hellenistic Jew, so a Jew who was intimately familiar with the Hebrew, the Jewish literature, but his mother tongue was more than likely Greek, and he was writing for a Jewish Greek audience in Alexandria. The date is the 1st century BC. The work shows a dependence upon the Septuagint, which was translated sometime before 200 BC. So for sure, the book was written after 200 BC. And the book is referred to in the epistles of Paul to the Romans and to the Ephesians. So for sure this book was written before the Pauline epistles. So most scholars would place it sometime in the 1st century BC. So not really that long before the coming of Jesus and the beginning of the New Testament. The place where it was written, probably Egypt and more specifically Alexandria. We see that the author shows a very good knowledge of Greek ideas and Greek thought. And in fact, there is a lot of attention given to Egypt in the second part of the book, that is in chapters 11 to 19. The author is actually quite scathing against Egyptian idolatry, and so this would have been risky business to write this kind of a book while living in Egypt, but nevertheless, he did it. The genre of the book, it's an apocalyptic wisdom book. So clearly it is a wisdom book, but also it has some apocalyptic traits, such as this hope that God will deliver Israel from the Gentile nations, and all these prayers and expectations that God will essentially judge the pagan nations that oppressed Israel, and especially Egypt in this context. What's the occasion and purpose of the book? To strengthen the faith of Jews in Alexandria. Again, these Jews who live in a pagan environment, probably under pressure to conform to Greek Hellenistic ideas, perhaps the pagan worship of the Greeks living in Egypt. And so it is intended to strengthen the faith of the Jews in Alexandria, but also the book is addressed to those who judge the earth at the very beginning of the book, and it's addressed to kings in chapter 6, verse 1. So probably the book is intended not only for Jews living in Egypt, but also for Gentiles, trying to call the Gentiles to some kind of faith in the God of Israel. The character of the book, ironically, is both Jewish and Hellenistic. Recall what we said when we studied Sirach, that we're in a situation where there's a lot more hostility between Jews and Gentiles, much more than, for example, at the time of Solomon. So the book is intensely Jewish. Like the book of Sirach, it tries to reintegrate a lot of Israel's religious traditions within the book itself. But ironically, the book is also thoroughly stamped with Greek culture and Greek thought and Greek philosophy. Again, like we said in Sirach, it's almost like the author cannot avoid this type of thinking because it's so pervasive in the world in which he's living. So there is a preoccupation with the Exodus. In fact, the whole second half of the book is a type of review of the Exodus, which would have been very relevant for the large Jewish population in Alexandria. At the same time, you might say, well, this topic is also really troubling for the Jews in Alexandria, because when they read the Bible, they would have read about the exodus of their ancestors from Egypt, how they fled Egyptian idolatry, and where are they now? In Egypt. It's like, hey guys, how did you get back here? I thought the Lord delivered you from this place. So this book would have been challenging to both Gentiles and Jews. It's an anthological composition. There is a use of many words and phrases from the Bible, though not really any quotations, so a lot of allusions from the Old Testament without actual quotes. There is a preference for the books of Genesis, Isaiah 40 to 66, Proverbs, and Psalms, so a lot of allusions from those books. And as we said, a strong influence of Hellenism upon this book. The canonicity of the book is deuterocanonical, so just like the book of Sirach, it is included in Catholic and Orthodox Bibles, but not in Jewish or Protestant Bibles. What are the themes of the Wisdom of Solomon? Once again, can't escape it, retribution. But here, the book of the Wisdom of Solomon provides a significant development in our understanding of divine retribution. Now let's summarize once again. Remember, retribution is follow God's commandments, God's going to bless you. Disobey God's commandments, you're going to be cursed. Who agrees with that? Proverbs, Sirach, retribution, we believe in it. Who disagrees with it? Job, Ecclesiastes. We're not sure retribution really works. You can be really righteous, and at the same time, you suffer a lot of hardships in life. So what's Wisdom of Solomon going to do is going to come and reconcile those two streams. And how is it going to do that? Well, recall that for most Old Testament books prior to this book, there was not really any concept of the afterlife. So what do you look for retribution? Your only point of reference is this life. And so you're hoping that you're going to be blessed in this life if you follow God's commandments. If someone is wicked, disobeys God's commandments, you're hoping that he's going to be punished for that in this life. Of course, Job and Ecclesiastes are right. It does not always work that way so neatly in this life. So what's the solution? Well, maybe this life is not all there is. And so for the first time, very clearly in the Old Testament, as we approach the edge of the time of the New Testament, this book, The Wisdom of Solomon, resolves this question of retribution by saying, well, retribution does work, but it's only going to be completed, fulfilled in the afterlife. In other words, it's not how long you live on this earth, it's really your eternal rewards that are going to make the difference. It's not how many children you get, but it's also how virtuous your children are. So there's a type of spiritualization of this idea of retribution, not only in physical blessings, but also in spiritual blessings and blessings that come after physical death. In other words, the future life with God is man's real destiny, and this is where retribution truly is complete and fulfilled. We see the recurring theme of personified wisdom, wisdom as a beautiful lady who courts her followers, and so as we've seen in the books of Proverbs and Sirach, we see more of this in the Wisdom of Solomon. As we said, the Wisdom of Solomon tries hard to be very pro-Jewish, but it cannot quite escape entirely this Greek thought and Greek philosophy and theology. And so we find some terms that are new, that are really Greek terms, even though the concepts are already found in the Hebrew Bible. Some examples, divine providence. So we know that providence, of course, is all through the Bible, the idea that God really provides for his people. But the actual term, the providence of God, is what we find for the first time in the Wisdom of Solomon. Conscience is mentioned in chapter 17, verse 10. And if you turn to chapter 8, verse 7, we see a listing of the 4 cardinal virtues. So most decisively a Greek concept here. Also, this idea of the knowledge of God is emphasized in chapter 13, a philosophical treatment of the knowledge of God, to be more specific. The Exodus as a new creation. So as we said, the whole second half of the Wisdom of Solomon is a revisiting of the Exodus narrative, but it portrays this Exodus not just as a redemption, but as a new creation of the people of Israel. This is not entirely new because, as we mentioned previously, In the book of Exodus, we see the children of Israel who are fruitful and multiplying in Egypt. So already the people of Israel are portrayed as a type of new creation in the book of Exodus. Only this is made even more explicit in the Wisdom of Solomon. Interestingly, the Wisdom of Solomon is silent about the Torah. Even though it is very pro-Jewish, it is exhorting all people to turn away from idolatry. It doesn't go into the specifics of the Torah, perhaps also pointing to the fact that the author had in mind that he was writing not just for Jews, but also for their Gentile neighbors in Egypt. Here is a general outline of the book. The two main parts. First, the praises of wisdom from chapters 1 to the very beginning of chapter 11. And then the rest of chapter 11 until the end, God's fidelity to his people in the Exodus. In other words, the first 10 chapters or so are the theory of wisdom. And then we see the practical applications of how wisdom operated during the time of the Exodus. So it's a practical application in Israel's history. So the first part, 1a, immortality is the reward of wisdom. So we're going to see how this big question of immortality resolves the troubling question of retribution. And then part 1b, the nature of wisdom and Solomon's quest for her, or pseudo-Solomon, the one who claims to be writing as Solomon. We're going to see how Solomon sought wisdom and found her in the second half of the first part. Then beginning in chapter 11, we see an introductory narrative, and then we're going to see this theme that Israel, during the time of the Exodus, is benefited by the very things that punished Egypt. So we're going to mention a few more things about that momentarily. And then we see an illustration of this theme in 5 antithetical diptychs. So 5 antithetical contrasts between Israel and Egypt, and that is found in chapters 11 to 19. Here is a more detailed outline, and we won't go into all the specifics of this text, but really just set the stage for your own study of the Book of Wisdom. So the book begins with this idea that immortality is the reward of wisdom. It begins with an exhortation to the kings of the earth to seek justice, and then we see a very interesting speech that is put in the mouth of the wicked. The wicked men, these wicked people who are very arrogant, they're very materialistic, hedonist. It's like, let's just enjoy life and even enjoy it at the expense of others, even if this means being unjust towards others. So we see that these wicked persecute a just man and really mock this just man in a way that's eerily similar to what we see in the passion narratives in the Gospels. Then we see one of the keys of the book in chapter 2, verses 23 and 24. God created man for incorruption and made him in the image of his own eternity. But through the devil's envy, death entered the world, and those who belong to his party experience it. So we have a commentary on Genesis chapter 3 telling us that why exactly did the serpent, who is a type of personification of the devil, why did the serpent even lead Adam and Eve to sin? Well, it was through envy. There's an ancient Jewish tradition that says that God commanded Satan to bow down before Adam and Eve, or to bow down before Adam because Adam was the image of God. And Satan refused. He said, "No way, Jose, I'm not bowing down before this creature made out of the dust of the earth." And this led to the devil's envy and pride that led to his fall. Then we go into the hidden counsels of God and notice that we have a chiastic structure. In fact, we're going to have 2 major chiasms in the Wisdom of Solomon. So chapters 3 and 4 speak of the suffering and death of the righteous. So are the wicked right? I mean, is it true that the wicked have nothing to gain, that we might as well just be these wicked hedonists? We enjoy life and we get rid of anyone who gets in our way. So we see the suffering and death of the righteous, and we see that the key is immortality. It's a response to the shortcomings of the traditional doctrine of retribution. And so we then see the fate and punishment of the ungodly. We're told that even the number of children is not an absolute blessing. In fact, sometimes it's better to be childless than to have wicked offspring, than to have evil children. In other words, virtue is better than to have physical descendants. So you can be fruitful by being virtuous. It's the beginning of a type of theology of celibacy here. In fact, even a premature death may be a sign of God's favor. So retribution is not necessarily living as long as possible, but it's really living well and being rewarded by God in the afterlife. Then we see, as we begin to close our chiasm, the final judgment. So we revisit the wicked, and all of a sudden, they see how wrong they have been. So in the second speech of the wicked, they understand that they were basically racing towards destruction as they stand before God in judgment. This is really the vindication of the righteous. And then we close our chiasm with another exhortation to seek wisdom. Therefore, O kings of the earth, listen, because it's not by power, it's not by oppression, it's not by injustice that you will succeed, but in seeking and finding wisdom and exercising justice. The next part, the nature of wisdom and Solomon's quest for her. We have a short introduction that is followed by a speech by Pseudo-Solomon. So this is where the book really writes in the style as if the author were Solomon. So our Pseudo-Solomon says that he is like other men. He is not really special in any way. And so he recalls how he prayed, and then wisdom and riches came to him. And then we hear Solomon's prayer in 7 verses 13 to 22. He prays for help to speak of wisdom. And then at the heart of this chiasm, we are told about the nature of wisdom. And we'll see that in the very next slide. So what is wisdom for the book of the Wisdom of Solomon? And then we begin to close our chiasm. Solomon sought wisdom, the source of all knowledge. Solomon sought wisdom as his counselor and comfort, and then Solomon realizes that wisdom is a gift of God. So even though Solomon is like other men, none of us really have access to this divine wisdom. Well, if we ask God for this divine wisdom, he will give it to us. And then we see Solomon's actual prayer for wisdom, mirroring in many ways the prayer for wisdom that we read about in 1 Kings. Then we have a transitional section where we see wisdom at work in history, and especially in the book of Genesis. Really, this chapter 10 leads the way, or it sets the stage for this commentary on the book of Exodus. So chapter 10 is a lot of fun because it mentions all the heroes of Genesis without naming them. So you can self-examine yourself with a little type of quiz, read chapter 10 and see if you can identify all those figures of Genesis who are alluded to but not mentioned by name. So if we go back to the center of our second chiasm, what is the nature of wisdom or of Lady Wisdom? Well, here she is an emanation of God. Recall that in Proverbs and Sirach, wisdom was present at creation, but she was still a created being. She was not God himself. She was not identical with God. While here she is an emanation of God, just like the rays of the sun are an emanation of the sun. You can't really separate one from the other. So we really come very, very close to this idea of a divinization of wisdom, that wisdom is a certain aspect or facet of God, if you will. And so we see how close this comes to the theology of the New Testament, where Christ is the perfect image of the Father and also the Father's wisdom. So there we have it, Wisdom 7:25 to 26. Wisdom is a breath of the power of God and a pure emanation of the glory of the Almighty. Therefore, nothing defiled gains entrance into her, for she is a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, and an image of his goodness. See how this language is very descriptive, kind of Greek Hellenistic? It's very different from what you would read even in Proverbs or in the Hebrew wisdom books. We also see extensive use of nuptial language. For example, Wisdom chapter 8. I loved her and sought her from my youth, and I desired to take her for my bride, and I became enamored of her beauty. She glorifies her noble birth by living with God, and the Lord of all loves her. Therefore I determined to take her to live with me. So strong language of marriage, of love, of marital cohabitation, both between wisdom and God and between wisdom and humans who seek her. Okay, now the second part of the book, God's fidelity to his people in the Exodus. We have a short introductory narrative, and as we said, the theme of this whole section is that Israel is benefited by the things that punish Egypt. So this is where we find these 5 antithetical diptychs. It's a little bit hard to follow because you have some long tangents throughout these 5 diptychs. But basically, the first one is short and easy to follow. Basically, the contrast is made between the water from the rock that provided drink for the Israelites and was a source of life for the Israelites, whereas the water of the Nile that was turned into blood and turned into a source of death for Egypt. So you see that water is a source of life for Israel, a source of death for Egypt. That's your first diptych. The second one is a contrast between animals, life-giving animals, death-giving animals. So the quails that for Israel provided sustenance, it was the food for the Israelites. And then we have various little animals that were part of the plagues for the Egyptians. Our author here inserts a bit of fantasy because he even adds animals that we never hear about in the book of Exodus. So we see several digressions here on God's power and mercy on false worship. Here is a scathing critique of idolatry in chapters 13 and 14, I believe, and also a digression on the serpents in the desert. So all this is about animals, whether life-giving animals or death-giving animals. The third diptych, the rain of manna that provided life for the Israelites versus the rain of hail and the storms that afflicted the Egyptians during the plagues. Then we have the pillar of fire in contrast to the plague of darkness. So the Israelites had this light, this pillar of fire that guided them towards God, towards Mount Sinai, whereas the Egyptians were in total darkness in this plague of darkness. That was also another symbol of death. Finally, we have the 10th plague, the plague of the Passover. And so the Passover, of course, was another sign of life for Israel and death of the firstborn for the Egyptians. Here we have a digression on the plague in the desert, a digression on creation, and this leads to the conclusion. So this digression on creation is where we find that the Exodus is reinterpreted as a new creation of Israel, in contrast to the decreation of Egypt. That's all I have for the Wisdom of Solomon. So once again, a very quick overview just to give you the main themes, the main outline of the book. Good luck and enjoy reading this book of the Wisdom of Solomon. Thanks for watching our course. God bless and see you next time.